Professor Kitcher, Professor Valentini, Professor Fowles here today. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to everyone else for attending. So my name is Sheldon Kwok. I'm a chemical physics major in college, and I'm the president of an organization called Scientists and Engineers for Better Society, which is hosting the event today. And this is Yang, who, and together we'll be co-moderating the event. So before we begin the discussion, we're just going to give a very brief introduction on some of our ideas about the issue, and to get everyone started thinking about some of the topics. So the general motivation for why we want to have this event was because we suspected there was a dichotomy between the sciences and humanities at Columbia. And we think that the fundamental reason behind this dichotomy is the different ways of thinking of humanists and of scientists. This has to do with their differing modes of inquiry and their approaches in solving problems. For instance, on one hand, you have a more humanistic approach, on one hand, using the scientific method. And I'm sure this is something the panelists would probably like to get into a little more. This type of dichotomy is perhaps best exemplified in the academic tendencies of both the university and of students. For example, one example that I always like to say is that at Columbia we have a class called Physics for Poets, but we don't have the symmetric class called Poetry for Physicists. So that's one example of a divide. And also in the courses taken, we find that a lot more science students taking humanities classes than vice versa. So we think that this type of dichotomy prevents students from exploring subjects outside their own comfort zone and studying the other domain. And in general, we think that this disconnect stems from a lack of understanding between the science and humanities, which is why we wanted to hold this event to begin mitigating differences between these two domains and raise awareness about this issue. So what are some of the implications of this dichotomy? Well, we think the most direct implication for undergraduate students is social, and has to do with stereotyping associated with different academic fields. And there are a number of direct, academic implications as well, having to do with the need for interdisciplinary research and policy. And I just have a couple of examples to show you that can get you started thinking. Climate change, for example, is a subject that involves both intimate knowledge of science and appropriate policy to reverse the damage that we've done. The recent events in Japan showed us a lot about nuclear energy and nuclear policy. Bioethics is a hot topic of discussion, especially to do with stem cell research, genetic engineering, etc. In anthropology, shamanism is something that many cultures practice around the world, the use of communicating with the spiritual world for purposes of healing. And the intersection between that and modern medicine perhaps would be of value to many researchers. We have a program called Narrative Medicine at Columbia. I think it's one of the only graduate programs of its kind in this country. And they study the relationship between patient-doctor and patient-doctor communication and how important that is in making important clinical decisions. And the recent advances in nanotechnology and our ability now to manipulate things at such a small level, we've created many new questions and fields of ethics that we never considered before. And one of those is human enhancement. And we have many opportunities at Columbia. One of them is the Center for the Study of Science and Religion. They look at intersections between those two fields as well. So the event schedule. Next, Yang is just going to spend a couple minutes on a survey we sent out to many students prior to the event. And then we'll have the panelists speak for around 7 minutes each. They'll respond to each other's comments, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So thank you for everyone for coming today. I know it was unfortunate since Passover begins tonight, but fortunately we had someone recording the event, so we'll definitely get this out for all the students at Columbia that I know are interested in hearing this discussion. So thank you again to the panelists, and here's Yang.
Thank you, Sheldon, for that introduction. Good afternoon, my name is Yang, and like Sheldon mentioned, I'm going to be presenting some of the results of a recent survey that we conducted. Just out of curiosity, can you raise your hand if you took the survey? Okay. Now, can you put down your hand if you, can you raise your hands again? Put down your hand if you were a scientist, or classified yourself as a scientist, because the remainder are humanities. Okay, great. So, in total, we had about roughly 150 respondents, about 100 of which classified themselves as science and math students, and the other 50 classified themselves as humanities students. And because the sample size was so small, we weren't really focused on any sort of rigorous quantitative methods of analysis. We were more curious what was the underlying structure of the distributions of the groups. So there were certain observations that we made from the data. These are not conclusions or any points that we're making, just certain observations that I want to bring out and set on the table so we can discuss soon. So the first observation that we made comes from the question, how do you assess the balance of the core curriculum? So in both groups, students who study science and math and students who study humanities and arts, in both groups there's a consensus that the core curriculum is very science light and humanities heavy. On the axis, in the x-axis, you see the responses on the left represent feelings that the core curriculum is too science heavy, and those are very sparse. And the axis on the right, the right side of the axis shows responses that represent feelings that the core curriculum is humanities heavy. The second observation is a little bit more subtle. It's that the perceived difficulty across the disciplines is more clear to students who study the humanities than it is to students who study science. So the two questions that we asked to get this sort of observation from were symmetric. The first is, how difficult do you find your experience with science and math? And then the second is the symmetric question, how difficult do you find your experience with humanities and arts? And so for the group that classified themselves as science students, you can see that the distribution of the responses is roughly centered at 5, which is the neutral response. So on the left side of the axis, you have the responses that represent feelings of ease, that the discipline humanities and arts or science and math is relatively easy, and then on the right, that these disciplines are relatively hard. Now this structure is not the same for students who classify themselves as humanities students. You see the question, how difficult do you find your experience with science and math, that most of the responses were centered in an area that's roughly difficult. So it's like centered at around 7 and 6. Whereas their responses to the question, how do you find your experience with humanities and arts, is centered roughly easy. Then the final, and we think the most intriguing observation we made from the survey, is that science students tend to be competitive in both science and humanities. Humanities students competitive more so in their own home ground and less so in science. And the first observation I wanted to point out to you guys is, of these 4 charts, there's one chart that doesn't belong. It's this chart. And the reason why this chart doesn't belong is because the other 3 charts are all skewed right. So the questions that we asked were, compared to others who share your academic interests, how would you gauge your command of science and math? The symmetric question being, compared to others who share your academic interests, how would you gauge your command of arts and humanities? And so for the science respondents, you see both of their the responses to both questions are skewed right. So science students tend to be competitive whether they're studying humanities or they're studying science. In the humanities group, you see that their response to the question, how do you gauge your command of science and math relative to people in your own academic interest, is kind of ambivalent. You know, there's more of a normal distribution, kind of like a bell curve type distribution centered around the neutral response. But in their own home ground here, how do you gauge your command of humanities and arts relative to others in your academic interest? They were quite competitive. So these are the 3 main observations I want to put down on the table for discussion. So without further ado, may I call the panelists up to their desks.